Well, welcome to the second week of the Introduction to Pastoral Care and Counseling, Care for Stories, Systems, and Self. And we're going to be talking today about the use of self in intercultural care. And I hope that this is a topic that's interesting to you. I hope you don't feel like you have to do it perfectly in order to do good pastoral care, that you can make mistakes along the way. And let's see what we can discover together about intercultural pastoral care. Let me just review briefly what we did last week. Last week we introduced the class and we talked about the syllabus, and we had some time for reflection on the care for stories, systems, and self. Specifically, we talked about some different kind of contexts in which pastoral care can take place. Congregational context, where you're caring for the story of the whole community. Individual counseling context, where you might be providing help through an important transition, such as loss or bereavement or marriage. And then the context of the hospital, where you might hear somebody's story as they're walking through the process of illness and the challenges related to illness, or you might care for someone's story in the medical field itself. So hospital chaplains are increasingly caring for the stories of the healthcare providers themselves. And in last week's discussion, we talked about attachment, time, context, and meaning making. And I talked about some stories from my book that illustrate those concepts. And so I just invite you to bring the notions of attachment, time, context, and meaning making into our conversation today about intercultural pastoral care and counseling, as we listen to the story from Carrie Doehring and we explore that story together. So today's topic is really that initial setting of pastoral care and counseling relationships. How do you establish the initial relationship? How do you get invited to care for someone's story in this deep way? Also, some basic conversation skills and an exploration of the context in which those conversation skills develop. When I was a hospice chaplain, I was assigned for the southwest quadrant of San Antonio, and I was caring for a man who had been in the United States during the Bracero program. And if you don't know, the Bracero program was a program in which Mexican farmers were brought over during World War II to help with the absences of farm labor, and then they were immediately sent back to Mexico. And this man, part of our work together as when I was his chaplain was me just showing up and kind of slowly earning his trust, because he didn't initially trust me necessarily as a white person. And indeed, he needed to tell me some of the stories of the experiences of being deported back to Mexico quite suddenly, without warning, the experiences of being mistreated in the fields by white farmers. And he needed to tell me those stories in a tone of anger, in a way that I could earn his trust as his chaplain. So the process of earning his trust in that relationship meant that I needed to do a couple things. First of all, I needed to hang in there and deal with my own anxiety. And I needed to do well enough in the conversation that I didn't get kicked out immediately. And then I needed to find ways to continue to come back, despite the fact that I had some maybe hesitation, or I didn't necessarily want to deal with that anger or that anxiety. And so that process of building trust in a relationship was a slow process where some kind of authentic understanding happened around his suffering. And as a result, he began to trust me as his chaplain, enough to invite me back. So you have to show an interest in a person. You have to ask that person questions about themselves. And you also have to be willing to tell the truth in that relationship, affirming what a person experienced rather than negating it. And you have to kind of be able to walk a mile in their shoes, at least in your mind, in order to be authentic and be trusted as a caregiver. So often you get trusted after tests in a relationship. You'll find in ministry that you'll want to be involved in something, but you won't necessarily be involved until people trust you enough to reach out, open their home to you, open this window into this particular ministry they care about, and let you be involved as a caregiver. So I was able to hear this man's story and let him be angry with me for long enough to kind of establish a relationship of trust. Because part of what we were dealing with in that pastoral care encounter wasn't just generic storytelling. It was storytelling about the past, about a particular set of relationships, white Latino relationships in the American Southwest. And because of those harms that had been done and the damage that had been done in that relationship historically, I needed to listen in different ways in order to earn his trust as his chaplain, and in order to be effective as his chaplain. I could have done some things to check out. I could have gone into problem-solving mode. I could have refused to hear his anger. I could have asked a lot of information-seeking, question-driven interviews. I could have kind of emotionally detached. But why I wanted to share that story with you is that sometimes I think in pastoral care, we need to find ways to let people use us and to use ourselves in the pastoral care relationship in order to build trust. So that's why we're titling this class today, The Use of Self in Intercultural Care. And for that, let's go ahead and turn to Carrie Doehring's work in the practice of pastoral care. Today's class is focused on her second chapter in her work, the basic ingredients of caregiving relationships. And so here's a challenge. I'm giving you one chapter in a very good book, The Practice of Pastoral Care. But I'm also going to encourage you to take a look at some of the other resources that Carrie Doehring provides, and then other resources in intercultural pastoral care. So let me just contextualize Doehring's work a little bit in the field. She's a former professor here at Austin Seminary and is now teaching at ILIF. And for the past several years, she's been doing some really fascinating work on Kenneth Pargament's research on religious coping, to examine how people use their faith to help them cope. So she's been interested in the spiritual aspects of an integrated spirituality that helps people cope with life's intense suffering. And she's used Pargament to help explain how people deal with spiritual distress in a variety of settings and some of the ways that they cope. She has recently been doing more and more work with PTSD and among veterans at ILIF, and we could have more conversations about that as well. Her book has come out now in 2 editions, The Practice of Pastoral Care, this edition, and then also she has a 2006 edition, which is the first edition. And so if you wanted to take a look at both and compare them, you might find some interesting changes that have taken place. The other main concern that Doehring has in this work is to prevent misuses of power in pastoral care and counseling. So if I was going to identify any aspects of her work for you to think about long term, it might be how power can be used and misused in the pastoral care relationship. Power is a central concern for Doehring, going all the way back to her work taking care, managing emotional boundaries in pastoral care and counseling. So part of what Doehring is doing in her most recent edition of this book, The Practice of Pastoral Care, is to describe all pastoral care as intercultural. And for that, she's using pastoral theologian Emmanuel Lartey and his notion of 3 aspects of intercultural care. The first aspect, and Emmanuel Lartey has kind of foregrounded the intercultural nature of all pastoral care. And one of his one of his important books is Pastoral Care in an Intercultural World. And Larty says three things. We need to balance three things in order for pastoral care to be intercultural. We need to know how a person is like all others. So this is pretty basic. They breathe, they eat, they die eventually, they poop, everybody poops. And then we need to figure out how people are like some others. So what groups are they a part of? What identities do they hold? And how do those identities impact how they live and structure their world? And number three, how someone is like no others. So what's the unique fingerprint in the shape of their story? So although I'm a cisgender male using the he, him, himself pronouns, I was born in Bangkok, Thailand, and those first 10 years of my life in Thailand shaped my identity in distinctive ways. So there's three things that have to be balanced for pastoral care to be intercultural, Larty says. One is a person has to realize how someone is like all others, those universal turning points that life goes through, where you pass from death to life, stop breathing. We also have to realize how someone is like some others. How does gender, how does sexual orientation, how does gender identity, how does race, ethnicity, social class all impact a person's self? What groups do they belong to? And then how is a person like no others? In the reality of the groups people belong to, they inhabit those in radically different ways. So what's the distinctive fingerprint of a person's life? The ways that they're like no others. And so Doehring says in her book, Practice of Pastoral Care, that we need to balance those three themes in order for pastoral care to be effective. So if you make a mistake on the like all other side, you think basically everyone's experience of birth, marriage, or death is the same. If you make a mistake in the like some other side, you might overvalue group identity and not see the distinctiveness of a particular story. And if you make a mistake on the like no other side, you might think of people as being just kind of radically able to invent themselves, their identities being so individualistic that their group self doesn't matter. So that's some of the background that Carrie Doehring is bringing to her rich work on intercultural pastoral theology in this chapter. So in my conversation with the man who was Mexican-American and who had been in the Bracero program, it would be impossible for me to ignore my own race and ethnicity in order to be effective in pastoral care with him. If I did that, I would alienate him because I needed to hear stories about ways we were different in the number two category. We were like some others and in different ways that made a difference to our lived experience and to the stories that needed to be told in pastoral care and counseling. So let's turn now to the basic ingredients of a caregiving relationship and this conversation that takes place between Mrs. Wood and Reverend Lee. There's a couple themes I'd like for you to notice here. Well, it might remind you a little bit of Kevin and Janelle in our conversation last week. There's a sense that somebody's coming to the church for pastoral care, but you don't know what the problem is. You don't know what counselors call the presenting problem in their literature. And so what happens here is that since we don't know what the presenting problem is, Reverend Lee has to lead from behind in order to be effective. And he has to use silence and pauses and not get in front of Mrs. Wood, especially because there's kind of a power differential between them. He, as an ordained minister, he's on his own turf. He hasn't sought her out, but she's sought him out. So there's a kind of power differential in how that relationship is developing. That means he's going to need to take his time and discover what the emerging concerns are for her. So what are some of the ways that Reverend Lee responds? One thing I'm noticing as I'm looking through these responses on page 38 and 39 is that he moves pretty slowly. And he doesn't give a lot of data, or he doesn't overlay a lot of emotion onto the scene. So Reverend Lee in number 5 says that sounds very difficult. And in number 6, he says, you probably have a lot of questions about your mother now. So he spends the first part of this interview not really answering a lot of questions, but reflecting back. This is called reflective listening, or listening for themes in someone's life. All too often in pastoral care, we can get into the trap of interpreting someone's responses. Oh, you must have this difficulty because of your problem with your father. Supporting a person's response. And that's like the Bernard dog going up the hill, where you rush to someone's aid and you want to save them from the feelings that they're having. You can also probe. Probing is when you want to ask for more information and you really feel like they need to know that their problem is X, Y, or Z, and you're just going to go after X, Y, or Z until they realize it. Evaluative, those are comments that counselors make that make it sound like you should have done something different, or if you would have only followed this path. And advising is getting in there and saying, I've got to solve this problem for you. You need to go to this particular type of counseling, or you need to solve this problem in this particular type of way. Another type of response is called understanding response. And this kind of response is the way of listening and then checking and seeing if you got it right. An understanding response can be either paraphrasing, where you state back to someone what they said, or it can be the more difficult task of naming someone's feelings with them. And Reverend Lee gets us to some understanding responses when he says, you've been concerned about her, for example. That sounds very difficult. And you probably have a lot of questions about your mother right now. He doesn't get us deep into feelings, which can be useful in a first interview. He doesn't use a lot of words like shame or guilt. And he also doesn't comment on body language very much, which is something that you only do if you really want to deepen a relationship later on. But I think if we were in the room in this conversation, it would probably take a lot longer than we might think. So I'd like for you to spend, one other thing I want to note is there's a turn he makes to asking about if it's okay if he gives some of his experience. Reverend Lee, number 7, on page 38. I don't know how you felt about that. When you're talking to someone, is it helpful to have them kind of ask permission? Or are you already talking to them and that's not really useful? He goes to the church context, which is really where she is, and that's the context for the pastoral care conversation. And he kind of imagines what it might be like for her to visit his care with this kind of backstory in mind. It's interesting to me, in the previous edition of this book, The Practice of Pastoral Care 2006, at the end of this conversation, the verbatim has Reverend Lee asking Mrs. Wood if she would like to pray, and then she refuses. And so Doehring sets that up as a teaching moment, that you don't just naturally assume that people would want to pray with you, but that you kind of ask for permission and see if that's okay. I don't know why for example, she takes that out in this edition. Maybe I can ask her that. I'm going to a conference during this week, and maybe I can ask her that while I'm at the conference because she's going to be there as well. So you might be asking yourself a couple of questions in reading this in reading this case study, and I'd like for us to explore them a little bit further. What's the difference in your mind between sympathy and empathy? Do you see any differences? I've heard sympathy being something that you can relate to, so you can help someone with. If you've had the loss of a child, a distinctive kind of loss, you are able to sympathize with someone suffering because you've been through it before. Empathy is something different. It might be based on not knowing just as much as knowing. And empathy is where you realize how different you are from someone else. So when you think about Reverend Lee and Mrs. Wood, I'm wondering if you think about this kind of relationship as working more on sympathy, a feeling with, of shared similarity, or more on empathy, the working precisely because of the differences between them, and building on those differences, allowing spaces for not knowing, and not being the same to kind of guide the conversation. I have a couple questions for you about Reverend Lee and Mrs. Wood. And they have to do with the fact, I'm wondering if you would feel comfortable or competent having this conversation with someone who came in off the street and wasn't a part of your church, but sought you out for a conversation about a presenting problem in their family. Would you feel, so what if you met with Mrs. Wood, a Korean-American woman, would you feel comfortable using yourself in that pastoral conversation? And what would some of the similarities and differences be in how you would handle that conversation? And another follow-up question is, do you think that Mrs. Wood would come to talk to you, given your social location and your identity? Was there something specific that she was seeking from Reverend Lee that she might not have found from you or I, for example? So you might be thinking, what are some similarities and differences, and how would I handle a situation like this? One of the things we talked about last week with my book was this "why me now" question. So I'm imagining that Reverend Lee has some of these questions, why me now, as he meets with this woman and has a conversation with her. And then I'm imagining he also has questions about the presenting problem. How do you let yourself be interested in the presenting problem without letting it guide you to be probing or evaluative or advice-giving, but rather allowing a kind of mystery of pastoral care to unfold? Doehring seems to suggest that this is a difficult and tricky process, and it involves our own emotional response to the person who's in front of us just as much as it does any tips or techniques we might have. So that's why we're talking about kind of the use of self in pastoral conversation. So we're going to move to take a little break right now, and I want you to, I'm going to ask you to switch gears and look at the conversation that Reverend Lee has with his advisory group. And that conversation is listed on page 49 through 51. And I want you, in reflection on that conversation, to think about what emotional resources, what kinds of self-care resources were available to Reverend Lee in order for him to have this conversation with Mrs. Wood in the first place. And then what are some of the ways that he processed that conversation with Mrs. Wood? How did he pay careful attention to matters of power, to not showing empathic distress in that conversation? And then what role did his counseling group play for him? Why do you think he took this verbatim to them finally? and what role did it play to have a group that he could kind of talk to about this pastoral counseling encounter that he might have been confused about. So when we get back, let's do this for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then come back and you can watch the second video where we talk a little bit about Reverend Lee's own personal work and how it relates to his identity as well.